Welcome to Basic Screen Development. In this session, we're going to talk about web screens and how they can be created. We'll look at screen templates, the types of content that goes into screens, and how we can use different screen variables. We'll also talk about fetching data and using the preparation to get some of the data that we need to put inside of our web screens. And to understand all of that a little better, we'll talk about the screen lifecycle so we understand how those things happen. So let's go ahead and get started. If we remember talking about web applications, we know that web applications are a request response and that the user is going to make the request through the browser and the server is going to reply with an HTTP response giving the user an HTML page. So that user will interact with the HTML page inside of the browser. And if they click on new links or if they click on buttons, they can actually make new requests to interact with those pages. So web screens are the application user interface, so they're a crucial part of any good application that we build. So when we think of the screen as the end user interface, we can see that there are a lot of different components that can make up a screen. There can be text inside the screen, there can be fields for input, pictures and places to place data, and buttons for people to go ahead and click and interact with. Inside of OutSystems, when we create a new screen, we can either create it from an empty screen or we can create it from a screen based on an existing template. The empty screen would just have some placeholders where we would be able to place different types of content that we're interested in, where a template would actually come with some of the existing components already inside the page for us. And in that way, we would just have to edit or customize that template and then begin using that as our screen. So when we think about the screen having content, when we begin working on the screen, we'll be working on the screen inside of the editor, which is in the main area of Service Studio. We'll be able to use our tools from the toolbox and drag and drop tools to go ahead and create content inside of the page. So here we can see a lot of different elements that have been placed on the page, and one of the ways we can understand those better is by using the widget tree. So this little less than and greater than allows us to see the hierarchy of all the elements that are on the page. So here we can see some of the areas like the header area, the title, where the actions are, like this button, and then the main content area. And here in the main content we have two columns, and we actually have a list inside of one column and other information on the page as well. So we can look at the content that's in the page by using the widget tree, and when we want to place new widgets or new content into the page, we can use this view to kind of see where things will appear when we work on the page. Now, screens also have screen variables. So in the previous slide, we were looking at the screen for the employee profile. And in that case, we were looking at the widget tree, showing us everything that's actually inside of a page. Here we're just looking at the elements of the user interface, and here in the employee profile screen, we can see that we have an input variable, two local variables, a preparation action, and then a save and a toggle edit action. So we can see when we look inside of the hierarchy in the tree area, we can actually see some of the elements that are there inside of the page. These screen variables can be very important because screens can have input variables, which means that when someone requests a page, they may actually pass some parameters with the request for that screen. And any mandatory input variables will automatically have values assigned to them. So if there's a mandatory input variable that is passed in, we'll go ahead and get that variable, and if not, it will be set to its default. Besides the input variables, screens can also have local variables, and those local variables will be initialized inside of the scope of the screen itself. And when we talk about all of these variables, they exist within the scope of the screen. So those variables exist inside of the scope of the screen for its complete life cycle. And if you think about the screen life cycle, when someone requests a screen, So if you request a new page and it happens to be the employee profile screen, this screen begins executing, and then it begins working with some of its variables, and it may call the preparation, and it will go through its life cycle, which we'll look at in just a second. So one important piece of that is that there is this preparation, and the preparation is what allows us to fetch data. So screens may need to display external data. When we say external, basically any type of data from outside the screen. So if we need data from the database, if we need data from somewhere else, the preparation is a special screen action which has access to the screen inputs and its local variables, and can then make calls out to get the other types of data that it needs. The types of data that the screen might be interested in fetching during the preparation may be information from databases, and there we can use aggregates and SQL statements to get that information. Or we could also use integrations to things like web services and RESTful services. And once the preparation fetches this data, that data then becomes a variable that is available for the rest of the screen lifecycle as well. So here we see the preparation that is selected, and we can see inside the editor that we're in the employee profiles preparation. And here we can see we're using an aggregate to get the employee by their identifier. And then we're using an assignment to do some work. And then we're getting the employee's manager from the database using an aggregate. And then we're making some decisions and either giving some feedback, or we're just ending out of the preparation. So this is the type of thing that can happen inside of the preparation. This is sort of a normal thing to do when we're preparing for our page. If there's external data that we need, we use the preparation to get that information. Now, how does the screen lifecycle work if we think about it from the very moment that a user will go ahead and make a request for a new screen? The first step is that any mandatory input parameters will be set to their default values if they aren't set to what was coming in the request. So if the request has already set that variable, that's great. If not, the input variable and the local variables are set to their defaults. So here, when we see someone working on a web screen and they request a new screen, here we see an input variable which would come into the life cycle and get initialized. Then we would initialize any of the local variables. And the next thing that would happen is running the preparation. After we run the preparation and that action flow gets the data from the databases and makes some of the decisions it needs to make, we then begin building, or sometimes what is called rendering, the screen. So between the variables and the preparation, we should have all the information we need that might be dynamically placed inside the screen. And then the screen just begins building the hierarchy of elements and widgets that need to be on the screen that will also display the dynamic data that was retrieved. So after that preparation runs in step 3, the screen is built, and then as soon as the screen is finished building, we'll actually send the response back to the user, who will get that inside of their browser. So that's the complete life cycle of how all of this information ties together, from us being able to define the content on the screen, interacting with the variables, getting the data from the preparation. These are all the things that help us build the screens that we need. So we talked about web screens and the fact that we can use templates to get started and create them a little bit quicker. We looked at how we can view and sort of organize the content in the screens, and how screen variables can be important so that we have data coming in from outside the screen, or variables to hold data inside the screen. We also talked about the preparation being important because we may need to fetch data, and then we tied that all together by showing the screen lifecycle and how the things are used inside of that lifecycle. So that's it for basic screen development. Thanks for listening.